I'd like to I'd like to welcome everyone to the St. Louis Community College Speakers Series. This broadcast is being recorded, and our speaker today is Mr. Dominic Chambers. He was born in St. Louis and now lives and works in New Haven, Connecticut. He is a St. Louis Community College Flo Valley graduate in art. He has a BFA from Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design and an MFA from Yale University School of Art. Some of his solo exhibitions include the August Wilson African American Cultural Center, the Militzer Studio and Gallery locally, and the Residential Gallery in Des Moines, Iowa. Mr. Chambers' work is in a number of private and public collections: the Centre Pompidou in Paris, Pye Museum of Art Atlanta, Institute of Contemporary Art Miami, Morehouse College Atlanta, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. He's the recipient of the Robert Reed Drawing Scholarship from Yale and the Varsity Art 18 Award from St. Louis Community College. He completed residencies in the New York Studio Residency Program and the Yale Norfolk Student School of Art. And he was named the 2021 Forbes list of 30 under 30 as one of the most promising artists of his generation. You may remember in September of 2023 through February 24, Mr. Chambers had a show at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis. It was called Birthplace, and it was an homage to the St. Louis, featuring places important to his development as an artist, items such as classrooms, libraries, playgrounds, and Art Hill. Welcome, Mr. Chambers. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Joanne, and thank you for such a warm introduction. And thank you to everyone in attendance for this talk. Um, this talk, I should preface this, that it may be a bit abridged, and we'll be circulating through a couple of new ideas, actually. So this is the first time I'll be talking about a recent idea that I've been navigating and thinking about in my studio, which is soul sharing. And so for me, to kind of get us started with respect to time, is this idea of soul sharing, which has become quite prevalent to me as an artist and as a person. For me, in very simple terms, really just means an innate vulnerability. The idea of consuming different types of material and digesting them through a collection of different sources, whether it be for myself, the natural world, or the literary world, and of course, as we all know, art history and the world of art, and then communicating that and depositing these ideas into an art object and sharing them with all of you. To me, doing that in a vulnerable and sincere and authentic way is really at the heart of many artist projects, including my own. And so, as we go through this particular presentation, what we'll talk about and what we'll see is how I navigate this idea of soul sharing in communion with different thinkers, poets, writers, and artists. And so, from this point of departure, I think is a great place to start with W.B. Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folks. And the reason I'm starting with this particular book is because this book was one of the earliest encounters I had with a Black literary figure utilizing like a surrealist language to describe the social and economic conditions of Black people. And I was familiar with the idea of magical realism through writers and thinkers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who I'll talk about a bit later. But what I thought was quite unique about Du Bois's work was that he utilized surrealist language and the idea of metaphor to describe the conditions and the life that Black people were used to navigate. In particular, this idea called the veil, which for Du Bois was the kind of social parameters that outlined the kind of collective understanding and examination of Black people, and rendering them in a way that kind of simplifies or, I guess, makes their state of being and their entirety of their character illegible. Right? It's open to interpretation through a white lens and a white gaze and white consumption. And so, what I appreciate about Du Bois's work was that he, along with writers like Zora Neale Hurston or James Baldwin, utilized this language to describe their conditions. And it seemed to be the only language that seemed to be the most effective at articulating what it is that they were navigating during the times of their work. And so the veil for me was one of the ways I thought about articulating the conditions of Black subjects in the world of painting and utilizing the language of abstraction to do so. But before we get to a lot of the work, I wanted to highlight two other figures in the landscape of magical realism and surrealism. For me, like these two individuals, so on the left hand side, we have Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and on the right, we have Andre Breton, who is accredited with writing the Surrealist Manifesto, which kind of outlined the ideas of surrealism and the kind of guiding compasses and principles that outline the surrealist movement. But what I thought was interesting about the idea of surrealism as it pertains to magical realism is that surrealism, in a lot of ways, is about the autonomous mind, right? Unlocking the subconscious and allowing that to animate the type of impulses or creative impulses one might have, whether it be in a literary sense or in a visual sense. Whereas magical realism, as it has been used by writers like Marquez or Junot Diaz or Du Bois, is that it's utilized to look at the kind of like social structure that outlines a collective state of being by a community or a collection of people. And for me, that was extremely fertile ground to think about a lot of my concerns as a Black person, but also as an image maker and a person who thinks about the representation of Black subjects throughout different images in art history. And so, from that point of departure, thinking about magical realism and its tool to describe larger ideas. I'm sorry, like there is some technical difficulty. I'm a bit of a fine artist, y'all, so please bear with me as I navigate this presentation. And so for myself, as I start to, again, consume this material, consume these ideas, and find myself also negotiating and navigating these ideas in works of my own, I started to develop a real fascination with this idea of circumventing the narrative of Black masculinity and boyhood. And so this work here is actually very old. I believe I made this work and the one that'll follow it. This was work I made when I applied to grad school. And a lot of this work was about displaying Black masculinity as a site of vulnerability. And in that space of vulnerability and in this site of stillness, the imagination begins to transform and impact and influence the natural world in which the Black subject occupies. And so the scene of these three Black boys laying in a field being greeted by these two spirits was a way of me thinking about the idea of magical realism, but also the narrative around Black bodies in moments of action, but and less on moments of rest. And that, for me, as we go through it in other images, was really at the heart of a lot of my earlier projects, where I was interested in negotiating the kind of overall popular narrative around Black activity, which is a hyperactive one, right? And we all have this because we live in a capitalistic society. And so at the inception of Black people being here, we were always associated as labor forces, as individuals that were utilized to create and maintain and sustain capital. And so it was very seldom that you encountered bodies in moments of rest or moments of leisure, which for me became a subversive and radical act. And in that space of, radicalizing and subverting a particular white construct or framework that is meant to frame how you live in the world was a magical one, right? It offered a space for different things to occur or a space for the inner vision or the inner life to flourish outside of external and political circumstances. So from here, we'll enter into more of my painting practices. And so for me, when I think about this idea of consuming information and recognizing that how I articulate an idea or articulate something must be in its way sophisticated, accessible, and also a comprehensive expression of a collection of ideas that I am concerned with, but have a relationship to the larger kind of cultural, like not zeitgeist per se, but kind of cultural dialogue. And so for me, this particular work is a great example of a lot of the ideas I had in the earlier two drawings, but the idea of the magic occurs in the usage of the color in the image. And so because I start to think about the language of colors, I started to examine them as a material that is embedded with a type of life that responds to the imagination of those who engage with it, but also those who see it, right? And so for me, that's also what I think about as it pertains to soul sharing, because objects, art objects in particular, do communicate with you. If you find yourself, attracted to a particular object or an image, it's because it has provoked something in the interior of your being, right? Whether it be psychologically or emotionally. you find yourself compelled to engage with it. And though it's not a verbal sense of form of communication, like images communicate to your soul, right? They communicate to that interior reservoir that you have. And that for me is compelling because it also shapes the way you engage with the world around you. You know, thinking again about the words of Du Bois and this idea of the veil as it pertains to magical realism. I started thinking about what lives within the veil. Like if I could articulate that idea, of the veil, and I understand it is inherently dematerial, right? Immaterial. It's not something you see, but it's something that you experience. Well, through the world of painting, I can give it a form, right? I can give it a life, and I can articulate what it looks like and the possibilities that reside within the veil through the articulation of the painting medium. And so, in this particular image, you may see a Black subject who is painted in a variety of different Blacks. And that for me is also a part of where the magic happens. Because when you think about the language of colors, Black is not something that necessarily needs to be kind of simplified in terms of creating space by operating from black to white and gray. But it also operates into a space in and of itself, right? Like black has temperatures. Blacks can be warm, black can be a cool color. And so orienting these colors next to one another helps maintain and solidify a particular image. And so for me, thinking about like color theory and thinking about the space of color theory for a surreal or magical conversation became in one way a backbone to a lot of the images that I began to make as a painter. And I say that because when I applied to Yale for grad school, I didn't apply with a painting portfolio. I applied mostly with drawings, and it was because I didn't see myself as a quote unquote good painter. And I think again, as you mature as an artist, and many of you who are artists who are, in the audience for this conversation, will also come to this conclusion too as you mature, that it doesn't necessarily matter to me, and perhaps not even to the larger dialogue or history to art, that you are a quote unquote great painter in the sense of technical skills and ability. But I'm interested in the quality of your ideas, right? And the type of images you choose to make and what legitimizes the existence of this particular image, meaning what necessitates it, and listening to the way in which a person articulates the necessity of this image and the larger collective dialogue and need for this image to, I don't know, be participated with. And so again, we're going to go through this a bit quickly. And so while the bodies of work may change, I may not go into depth about each and every single body of work because there are quite a few things in here. And my work operates on a myriad of different levels. And so this is a collection of the work from one of my first exhibitions, which was held at the Luce Gallery in Torino, Italy, where you'll see a big emphasis on the primary colors, the red, blue, and yellow. And it was because I was fascinated in building a language between these three colors or expanding my relationship to them in particular, and understanding that in each of those particular colors, there was a range of possibilities that was worth and exciting enough for me to go after, pursue, and study. Because for me as a painter, and I'm pretty sure many painters who are obsessed with color can agree, that color really is a character in our work. It is a protagonist. It is something that has a life. And it is a governing principle for how I build out and construct my images. And so from this particular set of images here, we'll move into another body of work, which is called the wash series. And so the wash series was a work that um, followed my primary magic series. And it had everything to do with this idea of the veil from Du Bois's work in a very direct sense, right? I went all the way in with this particular body work and really trying to figure out if the veil is a means of truly creating a form of abstraction as a way to understand, Black life or Black existence, meaning that it is something that renders you incoherent. Then the language of abstraction as it pertains to painting would be the most effective mode of making to articulate that idea. And so what I started to do was building out images where Black subjects would commune and converse with one another, and then completely shrouding them in washes of paint and gestural marks and motifs and pattern. Because for me, if I was to think about what the veil looked like through the visual lens, to me, this would be a fair enough representation of what that could be or what it could potentially be. And for me as an artist, as I move through my work, like I'm someone who is deeply invested in the idea of the grand image. And what I mean by that is thinking about an image that is the most sophisticated and strongest representation of a particular idea. And what does that look like? And what does it take for you to get there to have an image that operates at that level? That's also at the heart of a lot of my projects, is understanding what mode is the most efficient for articulating something. And, like as we go through this and we go to the work, I think it's also fair to point out that for the longest time, I didn't really imagine myself to be a person who made images. Like for the longest time, I originally thought I would like just tell stories. I thought I would be a writer. And this is important for the type of writers that I find myself in companionship with. Um, and this is because I think about, my attraction to storytelling and thinking about there is something specific about human beings that attract us to the quality of a good story. And if I believe that an object can communicate with the soul or can communicate with the imagination or at least provoke a sense of wonder in a person, that is another way of thinking about like what type of story you're receiving, right? And so for me, I'm always thinking about how do I shape these images to be, good storytellers. And so when I started to expand my idea of Black bodies at rest and in moments of leisure, as I was speaking about earlier on, I started to expand my net for what constituted leisure. I was reading a lot of Stoic philosophy at the time, and there was a book by a writer named Lucius Seneca, who's a Stoic philosopher, called On the Shortness of Life. And in that book, he articulates the way in which you use time as being completely relational to the type of life that you live. In other words, if you were to spend your life in service of capitalism to your job, to your spouse, to your friends, and you were to cumulatively add all those up, you probably didn't live a life of your own, relatively speaking. And for me, what what was important in that idea was thinking about ways in which you could, live a full life and what type of ways you can utilize leisure as a way to improve one's life. And so for me, I thought about modes of kinetic leisure, leisure that allowed you to move around the world. And in doing so, the activity of your rest also shifts the entire world around you as well. And so I began to be really fascinated in the idea of kite flying. And those of y'all who are from St. Louis, I am, and we all know where the St. Louis Art Museum is. It's on a space called Art Hill, right in Forest Park. And when I was a kid, and even now, I'm sure people would go to Art Hill and fly kites. And I was just kind of interested in this idea of this collective habitation around rest and leisure, and then the idea of applying color to the sky. And so, in this body of work, I became really fascinated with the utility of kite flying and how it impacts or influences, the way in which we relate to our own the external world, the natural world, but also to rest. And then throughout my research, I began to learn that kites were originally weapons of war. They were invented by the Chinese as modes to distribute packages, but to sight out other camps, and they were used as military objects. And over the years, they, of course, became domesticated and became something that we all kind of collectively associated as a leisurely pastime. But for me, the kite became a surreal object, right? And what I mean by that is that if you were to think about what a kite is, really, it's just a flat sheet of color in many ways. And so it's a way of painting the sky or allowing yourself to apply color to the sky. And it's funny that I say that because I think back to working with a couple of my friends' students in school, and they kind of discouraged me about articulating that idea to a couple of their painting students. They probably didn't want their students to go out and, start, flying a kite and passing it off as a completed project. But for me, it is the idea in and of itself that is exciting, right? And so what you'll learn too as I go through, my slideshow is that what I'm articulating in many ways is just the expression of an idea and the quality of these ideas because I'm thinking about them anyway. So if we were to think about this particular scene of these children running through the landscape and these kites are exploding through the center of the composition, like for me, I kind of structured the image in that way because I thought it would be an interesting encounter to imagine what would it look like if a rainbow could explode, right? Theoretically, if a rainbow could explode, shards of color will be everywhere, which could be akin to kites being in the sky. And again, you'll see my deep interest in color filled painting here. Like, so this gigantic yellow painting, the red one that preceded it, and then of course the blue one. And it's the collection of these three images, which are a part of a body of work that I have that's ongoing, which I call the Rainbow Project. And so at the St. Louis Art Museum, we have a painting that I'm very proud of to be in our collection, which is one of Ellsworth Kelly's spectrum pieces, which is, you know, a spectrum of a rainbow of different colors. But what was unique about that painting to me was that it reminded me of a child's xylophone. And so it was one of my first encounters with an object that sparked the memory of music to my mind, right? And ever since I saw that painting during my earlier visits to the museum, it got me deeply invested in kind of making a set of works that also responded to that particular image. And so this is the first the first in the first set of three that kind of composes that project. So this is Ophelia, and they all have names. And so the yellow one was Isadora, the red was Rosalind, the blue Ophelia. And you'll learn that again, like my fascination with the grand image, I have a deep attraction to encountering an image at substantial scale that really kind of yells at you to come participate with it, to come see what's happening, to listen to the type of story that it has to tell. You know, and to bear witness to it, you know, to borrow a quote from another artist. And for me, this engagement with something at a scale that allows itself, a painting that allows itself to kind of consume your line of vision, to allow you to immerse or fall into it, for me is an experience that is like no other. It's one that me as a visual lover, I find myself returning to time and time again. And this is what they look like, as I said, so the red, blue, and yellow. There'll soon be an orange, a purple, and a green one as well. And then from there, you know, the hope is to find a space to actually, you know, present all three in that in the fullness of their the fully realized representation of that work. So this was at an exhibition I had in New York, which was titled Leave Room for the Wind. And it was again centered around this idea of kinetic leisure, rest, color filled painting, but also pipeline. And so I made an image of the St. Louis Art Museum that was meant to, you know, summon the memory I had when I was a child during a field trip there. And so this is the kind of surreal or magical reimagining of an event that happened at St. Louis Art Hill. And so I also added a couple other artists in this presentation because I think it's important for understanding the parameters and the expansive way I think about soul sharing. So there's a poet who I really is quite important to me, not only as an artist but also as a person. Her name's Mary Oliver, and one of her most famous quotes. I mean, she has so many, but one of the quotes that I find myself most attracted to is this idea of attention leads to devotion. And for me, as someone who's a very attent looker or observer, I spend a lot of time observing the natural world and observing, you know, paintings, of course, but observing the kind of natural phenomena and the wonder that like that kind of happens in the natural landscape that perhaps we're overly familiar with it, so we kind of pass it off as a benign or mundane encounter. But there is a sense of magic that occupies the natural landscape. And one of the artists that I found myself in kinship with was Richard Mayhew, because he was an artist that looked at the landscape through the lens of beauty, magic, spirituality, but also a love of color. Like for many people who observe or is familiar with Richard Mayhew's work, like they identify him not only as a color-filled painter, but as a landscape painter. But for me, I think about him not only as a landscape painter and a color field painter, but also as an abstract painter. Because when you think about the composition of these particular landscapes, it isn't so much that they, you know, are landscapes in and of themselves. It's that the way the color is being used and the marks are articulated is that through the language of abstraction, because that's what this image is, a representation of a landscape manifests, right? Like that is what the language of abstraction is what's giving that landscape a body. And that for me is really a compelling way to engage with that particular work. And so Richard Mayhew, in many ways, became what Mary Oliver describes as a shadow companion. And I encourage many artists to kind of cultivate a number of shadow companions in their own studio, a collection of writers, painters, artists, filmographers, directors. I don't really care. But a collection of voices you respect and you admire and you feel like are deeply as invested in some of the ideas that you have in your own project, whether it be in your studio or any other type of creative discipline you're taking on. So I showed Richard Mayhew really because I wanted to center and highlight his work not only as a sign of respect, but because I think he has been a guiding force in the way I've approached my work currently. And so, uh, again, attention leads to devotion. And so I have a dog and I spend a lot of time outside. And I'm someone who's really interested in the poetic language of ideas, the poetry that resides in ideas. And to think about another shadow companion of mine, who is Renee McGree, he has a great quote that says, the role of painting or the primary function of painting is to make poetry visible. And so for me, as someone who spends quite a bit of time in the natural world, I start to find myself pondering certain kinds of I don't know, irrational phenomena. Like, what is it like to encounter a lightning bolt on Earth? Because we understand lightning bolts as being contained to the sky, right? Like there are sky phenomena that occur, and typically when they, strike the Earth, they destroy things. There's a path of destruction in their wake, and so I became interested in this idea of what it would be like to encounter a a sky phenomenon like a lightning bolt on Earth as a demarcation of a landscape and something that you can traverse through, walk through it and see it. And one day I was outside with my dog, and this is what I saw. Like I saw the shadow of a tree that looked as though it was, a descending lightning bolt. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. Like, and under normal circumstance, I may have totally overlooked this, but this is kind of close to what I want, right? Like this is kind of what I'm looking at. Now, how would I articulate that in an image in a way that my viewer also grasps and holds on to the poetry that I'm also experiencing, right? There's a couple more of those that I encountered. And this is what it looks like in my articulation of those ideas and what I see in the language of painting. And so I started this body of work called the Thunderscape that were embedded with a deep sense of poetry. And really, this body of work, the Thunderscape series, and those that are made around the same time, I don't necessarily see them as like concrete paintings, because they're different ways of me thinking about how to express a poem, more so than anything else. And so if we were to counter this image, yes, it's an image that has been articulated with oil paint. It's something you can read and enter, but it also is a representation of a poetic event, right, or a poetic encounter, and the poetry that resides within that particular image is conveyed through the articulation of those yellows. And so the way I made this particular image is by using a cobalt yellow, which is typically highly rich in its chroma. And so when you lay it down onto a darker surface, it tends to become quite luminous. And because it's highly chromatic and not really dense in body, the cobalt yellow, much like many other yellows, is very transparent in base. And so it allows itself to leave a ghost behind as you move it across the image. And so my fascination with this color yellow became um, deepened by my development of the Thunderscape series. Because what I started to understand is that yellow not only functioned as a color that was embedded with language of its own, but it was also an atmosphere that you can utilize and you can manipulate and can utilize it to build out an entire environment and then fill it with things that you may see or that may astonish you or things that just don't make any sense. For example, in this image, both the shadows and the painting are coming from both sides of the painting space, which makes no sense because we understand light doesn't work that way. But that's the kind of surreality in the nature of this particular work, is thinking about the functionality of light and then zooming out and thinking about what is called in art history a mise en scene, which is this establishment of a particular image, right? Like when one was to zoom out and was to observe something from within their own mind's eye, so to speak, what is it that you would see? And so this was one of the images I made within the Thunderscape series. This one's titled The Indra Sign. And I have a deep love for mythology as well. And Indra is the god of lightning and storms. And so I was thinking about this idea of encountering a thunderscape in the natural world and experiencing it as a sign from Indra. And then what would it be like to engage with, a thunderscape or a branch that is a part of that particular landscape? And so the role of play for me was also important because if you're thinking about the idea of soul sharing as an innate vulnerability, right, an innate way of being or innate way of expressing oneself, the articulation of this particular idea for me has been echoed out throughout other writers as well. One that comes to mind for me is the writer Federico Garcia Lorca and his great essay, The Theory of Play and Duende. And so for him, the idea of like doing something with soul or having a soul was described as duende. This kind of like dark and mythical force in which you have that you can go through the world and you can pull from it, especially when one is engaging in a creative endeavor. The endeavor that Federico Lorca uses in his essay is more so like dance. To watch a dancer move or to navigate a space, you can tell when she's moving with duende. Black folks, we say you move with soul, And so the idea of like, the soul, faith, prayer, like all these things, like they're just words, right? And they're oftentimes utilized to describe a certain type of phenomena or feeling that we perhaps don't have the language for otherwise, right? And so those are the words we use and we use them the best way that we can. But also the language of painting is a way to, give language and form to the things that are language and formless. And so again, thinking about the flying of kites in a field. And so going back to my appreciation and my fascination with color, for me, the language of color has been an ongoing presence in many of my projects since grad school. And it's understanding that when colors, they do communicate with each other, and not all colors like one another, but studying the language of those colors and understanding how to deploy them with a comprehensive touch in an image is also at the heart of my project. And so I wanted to share my palette just to give you a sense of how I orient things as I'm working. And I just want to be mindful of time because, boy, I'm going to run out of time if I don't speed up. Um, but yeah, and so understanding the language that colors have and articulating that through a visual stimulus, for me, that's also a central principle in my work. And so I also have this idea of composing images that are completely invented and are meant to be representations of a lot of my interior interests, right? The things that I feel I'm compelled, to express and to amplify my own voice. And so I've been interested in the idea of where do paintings come from and thinking about before we summon them into the natural world, into the world that we live in, right? And we see them as art objects, they reside someplace else. And the studio is a space in which you can pull those paintings from the interior reservoir and hopefully, if you can, oftentimes you're not very successful at doing so, but that's, kind of the point of working, you can manifest them as objects within the studio space. But, the goal for many painters is to figure out which image best represents the articulation of that idea. And so for me, this was the Studio Angel series. And so for me, one of the primary questions I was asking myself as I built out this image was the role of the angel in the studio, or the idea of representing color um, as an active protagonist, not just as a metaphorical one. And so, if color could be represented as a form, with a form, and could possess a body, if you could represent it, what would it look like, right? And for me, it would be that angel that is loafing around in my studio, which is what this image is a representation of inside this space. And it's almost as though the angel itself is born or summoned from that particular yellow, right? Because it's composed of that color. And so that's where the language of the poetics, the metaphor, the material all kind of coalesces. So I'm going to kind of speed up through here as to not hijack because I have a lot of things to show. Again, this is a representation of another artist's work. This is Henry Osawa Tanner, and this is his articulation of the angel, and the representation of this angel as a messenger. And so, for me, this kind of way in which an artist or a thinker consumes cultural material and then tries to articulate that through representation, through the painted medium, is quite, for me, quite fascinating. And how one artist articulates this idea versus another. So this is Osawa's interpretation of the Annunciation Angel, and this one is a painting by the artist Fra Angelico. And you can tell that I was probably more or so less taken by this particular image because of my fascination with the wings of the angel. And also, I've had an opportunity to see one of these in person at the Prado in Spain. If you haven't had an opportunity to do so, I strongly recommend it. They're remarkable images. Another another angel. And also to give you a sense of the scale, I'm someone I also make small paintings, though I don't show them as frequently as I do my large ones. I make small work as well. I also think that it's good to add some variety in here so that way no one thinks I'm overcompensating for anything. So I have some small work as well, and some drawings, works on paper. Drawing is and will always be my first love. It's the thing that really kind of grounded me in the world of making since I was a child. So another angel reading. And then other expressions of ideas that I had. So this particular image was born out of a body of work that I made during a very, very troubling time in my life. And so I found myself in therapy during a time in which my mental health was on a consistent decline. And one of the ways I operate whenever I find myself, kind of at sea or in the mire of grief or whatever, is that I try to seek out voices, right? I seek out shadow companions. And I try to find a perspective or a point of view in literature that can help guide me through whatever set of issues or circumstance I'm navigating. And so, and during that time of my life, I became really, not necessarily obsessed with, but kind of um, enticed by the poetics of the past. And I became interested in this idea of self summoning. What would it mean to self summon or to summon past versions of yourself as a means to offer perspective and guidance to where the current you currently exists? And so, again, these things may seem like, I'm waxing poetic, but it really is a deep acknowledgement or an investment in the ideas, right? And the possibilities that ideas have. And so, in the Shadow Work series, I turned to artists like Jonas Vermeer. And this particular image was important to me because, of course, we all know it. It's the girl with the pearl earring. But what is significant about it, and what I don't hear talked about often when it comes to this particular image, because when people think about Vermeer, we all understand him as the artist, the master of light, right? Like he understood how to capture the sense of light that lived and dealt, and to capture what we call the daylight effect. And so, with this particular image, the object of the light is actually the subject in the painting. So if the black background is flat and it doesn't describe the environment in which the subject is living, then how is it that we're able to see it? And it's because the subject herself is the light source. She's the thing that allowing that space to be illuminated. And so for me, I was interested in the poetics of a particular gesture. So again, creating a sense of, these are like shadow self-portraits, the idea of shadow working, which is an idea outlined by Carl Jung. And I have no shame in admitting that, yeah, this body of work was made during a time in which I sought out therapy. And this is what I mean when I say, soul sharing is simply an innate vulnerability to just lay it all out there and articulate the space in which you were when these artworks were born. Shadow work chapters, Fairground Park. And this is what a collection of that body of work looked like when they were together. Still large scale, but a deep emphasis on neutral color and an emphasis on the idea of this atmospheric rainbow subject that lived within the space of the subject that was engaging with a degree of shadow work. And so when I was in St. Louis, and this is probably why my life was so fucked up during that time, I had to go to therapy, was that I was for a time and for a period, I lived under difficult circumstances. And so as a child, I had the opportunity to observe a playground at night. And what fascinated me about a playground was that oftentimes most of us encounter them during the day, right? And we see them simply as what they are, objects to play on and to engage with. But really what they are is just public sculptures. Like they're object that you aren't like, if you were to think about something like a Donald Judd, you still might want to climb that thing, but you're not really supposed to. But it does attract you, right? Like this idea that public sculptures invite the human to engage with it, right? Where there's a symbiotic relationship to our attraction to it and the activity we can have and the benefits we gain from our engagement, right? Like a playground is a space where children form social contracts. And so for me, understanding it as an ordinary object, but witnessing it at night and seeing how it transformed because the environment, transformed as well. Like at night, the playground to me started to look like a castle because all I saw was the silhouette of it, right? It was cascaded in shadow because it was the middle of the night. And so my interest in how an object that I'm overly familiar with and I understand the function of has the opportunity to shift due to environmental circumstances was quite compelling to me. And it was something I saw as a kid that I never forgot. And I knew that I wanted to share this sense of astonishment with someone. And so, again, the surreal nature of an object that we're familiar with. I also got it in my head that I wanted to make an invisible playground, thinking about the idea of a surreal object, an object that you understand the function of, but it subverts your understanding of how you engage and participate with it. But the goal was to make this thing like, I don't know, like 15 feet by 20 feet long. So you can actually, it can actually hold the weight of children and children can engage with it. But it's like a really expensive idea. And since I couldn't, I would have to sell a lot of paintings or something like that to make something like that happen, you know. And so since I don't have, that type of budget, I'm working on a McDonald's budget in many cases. I settled for about 6 feet. So this particular representation of that playground was actually on view at the Birthplace exhibition I had at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis. And this is, one of the ways I was hoping that the painting, the structure would function. And this is just an installation image of different environments I felt were birthing grounds for the kind of creative impulse and intrigue that I have as an artist today. And so you have the classroom, the library, St. Louis Art Museum, of course, and of course Fairground Park, which is located on the northern side of St. Louis. Go check it out. So moving on. And you can kind of see how the playground kind of evaporates against the glass window, right? Like this idea that it does shift its orientation based off the lighting circumstances or how you encounter it in the space. And so, speaking about Rene Magritte, this is one of his paintings that I wanted to share with all of you because this painting was born out of his appreciation for both night and day, of which he could neither choose which one he privileged or favored over the other. So he put them both together. And I remember seeing these paintings when I was an undergrad, and they never like left my imagination. Like they made a profound impact on me. And it's kind of strange that no one talks about them often. Like no one talks about them that much. But I think these are such gorgeous paintings, and I wanted to share them if for any reason at all, but for the poetry they offer, right? And this is, of course, how that particular image influenced my recent work as well. And so I'm someone who I'm not an astrophysicist, but I love thinking about like the stars. I love thinking about the grandeur of what it is to live on Earth and to be a part of something like our universe. Like there's a lot of strange things that if you were to articulate them, it may sound as though you're weaving a fable, but you're not. So the transition from having a singular object in the sky that illuminates us to having a constellation of glimmering dots above your head. To me, the portrait between those two things was really fascinating. And so this painting here, which is titled "Of Stars and Clouds," is meant to, in some ways, articulate my fascination with night and day as well. And this one also is another starscape. That's me imagining what would life look like on Mars. And then if you think about it, like if we were to colonize Mars, there's like no real reason, or there shouldn't be any real expectation that foliage and greenery would sprout from the soil on Mars's Earth, on Mars, Mars is Earth. That's funny, but on Mars and just be green, right? Like there's an opportunity to imagine what would life actually look like there. And one of the poets that I found myself communing with and in conversation with as I developed this work is Tracy K. Smith. If you're not familiar with her work, I strongly recommend you become quickly acquainted with it because she's brilliant and the way she thinks about the world, the cosmos, the grandeur of anything small and big, like she's extraordinary. And so this was one of my images that were meant to articulate my own fascination with, stars, clouds, but also the cosmos. And if you think about it, if you were to design a star, it doesn't look that differently than a snowflake. You know what I mean? In terms of like their overall graphic design, if you were to encounter them like in a coffee shop during the winter season, Like they just look like stars. A star is just a multi-pointed object, or at least that's how we design it, right? But in the cosmos, it's a glimmering ball of fire. And so for me, like the poetry of language too, like the poetics of how language shifts in and out of legibility for how we articulate or describe a particular thing, like that fascinates me as well. And then thinking about the idea of soul nourishing, like what does it mean to nourish oneself and the opportunity that is made available to you when you do so, whether that be through your engagement with a kite or through the sustained engagement with a book. And thinking about the opportunity that engaging with a book offers you. And we understand that the representation of many Black people when it comes to being represented as scholarly individuals or individuals who are capable of reading, those are generally very scant, right? Like if you were to observe paintings of the Medici family in Italy, it's very common that you see them probably with a book. And it's because that family understood that having that object was a form of establishing them as not necessarily probably hierarchical for sure, but more so as a learned individual, an individual of sophistication and of class and of prestige, right? Because you have this object with you. This object represents your access to knowledge and logic, and knowledge is it's a currency that is inexhaustible. And so my representation of a Black subject engaging with that book is meant to circumvent that and also to fill that void of Black subjects who are seeing in moments of leisure, but also reading a book or engaging with them. I'm interested in that project, but I'm also interested in the idea of astral projection, the idea that when you're immersed in a particular text, that you have the opportunity to have an out of body experience, right? The imagination takes over and it permeates into the natural world. And so for me, like the book as a medium for transportation or a medium that allows you to travel or a medium that allows you to heal for me is quite important, right? And the representation of the Black subject in that particular medium. And I think, not to harp on this too much, but I think that if we were to look at why the representation of Black subjects matters so much, is that representation is everything when you see those images, right? If we were to think about a figure like Frederick Douglass, who I'm not sure many people know this, he was at the inception of the daguerreotype, which is what we understand to be the photograph, the most documented man in the Americas. And it was because Frederick Douglass understood the power of images. He understood the power of being represented in an image in a way that is dignifying, right? Because if you understood a person with dignity and with respect and with power, it wouldn't be too far off for you to believe that they also have a soul like yours, right? If you dehumanize them and you rid them less them, it's easy to believe that they don't. And I also appreciated during the time of the daguerreotype that the photographs were typically like pretty small. You could kind of pass them off, you can exchange them. And we can and kind of works from that particular era now. And we understand that it was not everyone was getting photographed at that time, but it was a revered art form and practice, as it still is today. Like artists like Tyler Mitchell and Chai Keith, like these artists who hold the camera, I am fascinated and deeply invested in how they represent our narratives because I understand the power that represents. And so to end off on something, because and I'm sorry, we're close to running out of time, and I want to still leave space for questions from you all. Um, I wanted to lead off on a mural that I most recently put up in St. Louis, which is titled "For You, All the Color in the World." And the impetus for this particular image was my fascination with the inner vision, right? The interior landscape, the Black inner landscape, and this idea of Black interiority. And so, of course, we're familiar with my appreciation and fascination with the natural landscape and the poetry that resides there, but also thinking about the space for the Black subject to yearn for or to search for, right? And to hopefully fully realize. If we were to think about the slaves that went from the South to the North, they were compelled to do so not only because of, circumstances could, relatively be better, but they were compelled by their inner vision, right? The belief and the hope that something on the other side of that could be realized and better for them. And what I appreciate about painting in particular is that it's one of the art forms that you can have that allows you to articulate and manifest your inner vision quite quickly and very directly, right? Like because it's a medium you can have. You can summon these things and you can materialize what it is that you feel and what it is that you see and what have you consumed. And you have the ability to share that with anyone else. And that's something I also appreciate about literature and about language, right? As these vehicles for being delivery systems of what is it that you find yourself invested in. And so with this particular mural, it's a reminder and an invitation to my community to live a life filled with color. And the reason it's also, painted in this dominated yellow color filled format is because, while some people may view the color yellow as something that's challenging or a bit, optically garish, but I do view it as a very invitational color because it's so transparent. It almost invites other colors to engage with it, right? Like other colors can be seen, they can participate with it in a very fascinating way. And so for me, it all kind of like circles, ties up there. Like my appreciation for poetry, for literature, for ideas, and my desire to share these things because they have astonished me, they have influenced me, and other artists' work that have provoked my imagination. Like in a very vulnerable sense, like I want to share these things with other people as well. And so, yeah, I guess I'll end this talk here with this particular mural and I'll open it up for questions. So if there's any work that I may have sped through or did not give an in-depth analysis on, please, like, don't be shy. Just ask me, and I'm more than willing to articulate an answer for you.
If anyone does have a question, you can raise your hand or you can put it in the chat. I'll just read some of the comments. One comment is the cracks in the pavement converse with your mural. And that's very interesting. I wasn't looking at the cracks.
Oh
Another,
yeah.
another comment, love the dualities you're working with. Magritte masterclass reference material. And another viewer says, for me, the notion of the veil also brings to mind Ellison's Invisible Man. What lies beneath the veil in this read is intriguing, the gratuitous violence, sexuality, self-loathing. So just some of the comments. Where can viewers see that mural? You mentioned it was on Washington Avenue.
Oh yeah, it's right across the street from the High-Low, and I believe their address is 3301 Washington Avenue.
And then I have a question. I was reading an interview with you in the Riverfront Times. In addition to the veil, you mentioned the uncanny in your work. Yeah, could you tell us more about the uncanny?
I would have to know the context in which I was expressing that idea.
Oh,
Because yeah, because I think there was a very like particular question about the idea of the uncanny.
yeah,
And yeah, I
it,
don't remember what that question was that allowed me to like, articulate that in the manner in which I did. But yeah, I'm pretty sure there's something to it though.
right. You're talking about the surreal and the uncanny in our everyday experiences.
Mhm.
And then I had a question for your series, The Rainbow Project. How did you come up with the different names like Ophelia? How,
Oh, um, so I come from a very matriarchal household. I have five sisters, and so like naming them all after like women, like that's probably like where that comes from. But they're also songs, some of them are writers. And they're also the other three I'm thinking about will have the names of writers. So Rosalind is a song, Ophelia is a song, Isadora is a song. And the plan is to have the next three, the orange, the purple, and the green one, to be authors. And so you'll have, I don't know, like Zora Neale Hurston or Bell Hooks or things like that.
do you work in the medium of photography too?
I do not work in the medium of photography. I am very, I don't know what you would describe. My hands don't make sense with a camera. I defer that to the photographers and I really respect the work they do and I rely on them. But I don't have that skill. I mean, I've used a camera, of course, before, like as a student, but like it's not something that I return to in my own practice. I deeply appreciate photographers and I collect photography.
And a viewer said, for us local St. Louisans, please come to see the mural at Walls Off Washington. So they've got the website for that. I saw too on some of your website, you have cute pictures of your dog. Have you ever painted your dog?
I painted her as a silhouette once, in the Thunderscape painting. Um, but I don't know if oh my, I am having such a difficult time with Zoom right now, and I don't know how to move this thing. And so I'm trying to get it out of the way so I can screen share again, but I'm struggling with this thing. And
Oh,
so I'm not gonna try and mess it up. But
oh, that's
yeah.
okay. We've got one more question. What's your writing practice like?
Oh yeah, I saw from the wonderful Kilolo. Yeah, I saw her question pop up in the comments. Yeah, so my writing practice is I write about what I'm interested in. You know, really, I write about other artists. It really when I have the time to focus and sit down and really give it my attention, like my writing practice is very, very important to me. But I originally thought I was going to be a writer, like for the longest time. I thought I was going to write stories. And this is also why I really like the idea of soul sharing. This ties back into writing. Is because like when I first utilized the term soul sharing, I was having a conversation with a friend at this place called Edgerton Park, and we were just talking about how good it feels to be able to like have a very vulnerable conversation. And the reason this ties into writing for me is that I'm someone like I want to be and I value being a very attentive listener. Like I'm really fascinated by the type of language a person used to describe something, whether it be an event, another person, themselves, their life. What type of language are you going to use to articulate your experience, right? Because that is storytelling, right? It may not be a very direct one. You might just be narrating, hey, an experience, but like you have my attention. And then for me, thinking about your relation to language is extremely important. Like why represent something in that way? And so that's where how I think about my writing practice because I don't know if my paintings are always the most sufficient medium to articulate what it is I'm thinking about. And so, if not, I also kind of write these things out. So when I have an exhibition, like the Leave Room for the Wind exhibition or the Marikey exhibition that I had in London, I write comprehensive essays about them. And it's because I'm just really passionate about these ideas. And my goal as an artist and as a person is to articulate this fascination like to any measure that I can with a degree of care to you because it astonishes me. And so, yeah, like for example, there are artists like Richard Mayhew. I love his practice, so I want to write about it. I also want to write about the soul. I want to write about love. I want to write about anything that really like inspires me. And you know, I don't know who said it. Maybe it was Bob Dylan, but there's a great guy who had a quote that says, "Anything worth thinking about is worth singing about." I love that. It's like if it's worth thinking about it, it's worth singing about it. If that's the case, shit, it's worth writing about it too. And so I think like every artist should probably cultivate that particular relationship with their work.
And we've got one more question. It says, do you find you are consistent in your painting and ideas? Do you go in waves of more input, of reading or delving into references and resources of your companions versus ongoing output of making?
Oh, that's a good question. It's an in-depth question. You go, and I'm sorry, I'm going to read it quite quickly. Um, I would say I think I'm relatively consistent. I think I have an overactive imagination, and so my mind is always moving anyway. And so, like for me, like there are so many things I want to get to, and there's so many things I want to share with the people who have continuously showed up to be interested in the things that I'm thinking about or the things that I'm consuming. And so, like, I look forward to getting to the studio to make something and to work. And I also look forward to finding out what my friends are working on, what they're thinking about, because like I've not been, you know, there's always like this weird thing in the art world where you think like, oh, everything's competition. I don't have that. Like I want to make sure that you're making the best work that you possibly can because I'm invested and I'm compelled by your project. And so when I'm speaking with other artists, like I take that very seriously. That's why I also take it seriously to learn more, to think more, to be a better person, to be a better painter, to be a better thinker, because I'm part of a community, right? Like there are people who are going to show up who care about what it is that you have to say. And I want to make sure that I have something of substance to share with them. And so I try to be pretty consistent. Like that's a value of mine. Just like discipline is something I value. Like remaining committed to my work. Like it doesn't matter what you do. And I tell this to students whenever I have the opportunity to work with them, is that you could be like, you could do anything in the world. right? I don't care if you're an artist, a writer, you're a gardener. If you don't have discipline, it just won't matter. No, it just won't. Like, you can you can know everything you want about plants, how exotic they are, what type of soil they need, how to water them. But if your discipline falls off, your garden is going to die. Nothing's going to grow there. And so I apply that same type of energy to my studio practice and to my mind. You know, I hate not being able to articulate myself well or to not convey an idea because I respect ideas. I respect the way I articulate them with people. And so, yeah, I would say that that's it. I don't know if that answers anything about what she asked, but I hope that's useful.
Well, thank you so much. We are out of time. Mr. Chambers, thank you for sharing your work and sharing your afternoon with us as part of our speaker series.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me. And thank you to everyone who showed up to hear me speak.